voice echoed in the air. A young girl of 16 years old started her evening walk home through the cornfields. The walk into the corn has always been the shortcut everyone took to the other side instead of taking the long road around. She was hoping to get home before it got too dark, but she left work at the local grocery store a little later than expected. She worked as a cashier after school. Now, her family wasn't poor. They lived comfortably for a large family of 8 and afforded a decent life in the farming community. But she wanted a little spending money of her own for odds and ends, and of course to hang out with her friends after school and on weekends. She gently touched each stalk with her fingertips as she did every other day. When she took the shortcut home, the coarse feel of the corn pulled at her fingertips ever so slightly, gently bending as she brushed through them. She walked quietly as usual, just lost in her thoughts, thinking of the next thing to do and the cute boy at school. Without realizing, she smiled to herself and looked down as she continued her walk, until suddenly her thoughts were disrupted by a rough rustling sound from inside the cornfield. It startled her. She jumped a little from the sound, nearly dropping the book she held in her arms. She held him closer to her chest to stop the pounding of her beating heart. Slowly the pounding in her chest subsided, but the corn was still rustling. She stared into the corn, and as it was getting louder, she could figure out where it was coming from. Then it stopped. It felt as if something knew she was looking at it, but she couldn't see anything. She couldn't see where the rustling was coming from. "Who's ever in there? Stop messing around!" she almost yelled. The corn just stood there swaying in the wind as they were when she started her walk home. She looked to her left, and then she looked to her right, but there was nothing there. The rustling stopped. Only the sounds of cawing was heard off into the distance. She heard herself it was probably a flock of birds flapping around, so she just shrugged off the sound. She reminded herself nothing can hurt her in the corn, so she continued with her walk through the cornfield. She didn't even walk but 3 feet from where it was, and then it started again. The rustling in the corn. She stopped for a moment and looked around, but like before, she couldn't see where it was coming from. She could only hear the rustling. It was closer this time. It felt like it was behind her. She stood still as panic began to set in. There's nothing there, she thought to herself. There's nothing there. She was finally able to break free of her panic and looked all around her. There was nothing there. She looked up and down the aisle. She even tried to look through the corn, but she couldn't see it. She couldn't see where the rustling was coming from. She finally saw the rustling in the corn. It was coming towards her. Her heart was pounding so loud it drowned the sound of the rustling. Too afraid to run away, she stood there, just staring at it as it seemed to run towards her. Then out jumped 3 boys. "Ha ha, we got you," said the leader of the group. It was just her friends. They followed her into the corn. They all lived in the same neighborhood and often walked each other home. "You guys scared me," she said. They all walked home and laughed about scaring her. But it wasn't but a few minutes that have passed that they heard the rustling in the corn. Thinking nothing of it, they shrugged off the sound and moved on towards home. And then the rustling came back. They stood there staring at each other, then back into the corn. "It's probably nothing," said one of the boys. The rustling stopped. "It's not nothing," she said. "There's something there. I can't tell, but I think I see something." A menacing dark shadow could be seen inside the corn. Everyone could feel its presence. They started to back away from the corn. They knew they had to run away, so they started to walk faster. The rustling began to follow them. When they got faster, it got faster. They dropped everything in their arms and ran as fast as they could. She felt the rustling right on her neck, but it was like was like they were bathing in the moonlight, sitting peacefully on the bench. Now it didn't seem right. It frightened her. She looked to her friends. They stood still, unable to move. They were just staring at it. And then suddenly it moved. It stood up and stared right back at them. It looked like a woman. It had a long, slender body and long hair nearly touching the ground. It stood there with its arms stretched. And for some reason they could feel its glare, which sent shivers up and down their spines. They couldn't quite tell in the moonlight, but it looked as if it was moving its head left and right, like it was saying no. "We need to go," she said to her friends. "We need to go." Its head started to move towards them. It was as if it was stretching away from its body. As they ran